Part 2, Drowning Dreams. Chapter 27. By the time they returned from the library, Neil and Wesley had filled in Bree on Gladys' story. They stood uncertainly in front of the shop, waiting for one of them to make the next move. "Something feels wrong," said Bree. She began to shake her head, and Neil knew they had a problem. "I think we should leave it alone." Neil threw his hands in the air. "A few minutes ago you were all for figuring this out." "Yeah, but that was before I learned the truth. Nurse Janet is alive, a far cry from being a murderer's ghost." Neil rolled his eyes. "Far cry? That only means we have more questions than before." Wesley nodded. "We have to do something." "And what's that? Call an old woman in a nursing home, please." Bree held up the thick book she'd borrowed from the library, petals on the wind. "I just want to forget all of this, sit by myself and read." "Where, in California?" Neil spat. "You guys!" Wesley stepped between them. "Stop!" He took a breath. "If Bree doesn't want to be part of it, Neil, then you and me can call Miss Riley. It's fine." "Thank you, Wesley," said Bree, glaring at her brother. She sat down on the sidewalk beside the shop's front door and practically shoved her nose into the paperback book. Inside, Neil and Wesley asked Claire if they could use the phone. She was busy with a customer at the register, so she didn't even blink before saying yes. They crept to her office and called the number that Neil had written down at the library. A bored-sounding woman answered. With his heart racing, Neil asked if the woman could connect him to Janet Riley's room, and she immediately put him on hold. Seconds later, she informed him that Mrs. Riley was sleeping. She sounded as if she was about to hang up, but Neil quickly asked if Whispering Knoll accepted visitors. "Until 6 p.m., the operator said, then the line went dead. "How are we going to get up there?" Neil asked Wesley. "My aunts are busy, and anyway, I don't think they'd take us when we told them who she is." "I know someone with time on his hands," Wesley said. They made another phone call, then waited in the cafe for their ride to pull up. 15 minutes later, Eric arrived at the curb, behind the wheel of his mother's sedan. "Where's Bree?" Eric asked as the two boys slipped into the back seat. Neil was about to tell him when someone yanked the front passenger door open. Bree peeked inside, her eyes wide, her knuckles white as she dug her fingers into her book's cover. "Where are you guys going?" she asked. "Where do you think?" said Neil. "We couldn't get through on the phone, so—" "I'm coming!" Bree said, and then slid into the front seat. She slammed the door shut. Eric smiled petulantly. "Well, it's nice to see you, too." "Please, just drive," said Bree, peering into the rearview mirror. Eric put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. "As you wish," he said. "What made you change your mind?" Wesley asked. Bree huffed a sigh. She sounded annoyed. "I saw something," she mumbled. "Something?" Eric said, curious. "Someone." Bree buckled her seatbelt. "When I was reading, I felt like I was being watched. I looked up." She shivered, remembering. "A girl was standing across the street in the alley. I couldn't see her too well, but I noticed she was dressed in a white dress, like a hospital uniform." "Just like the woman I saw near the playground," said Neil. "The girl I saw looked like she could have been any age, I guess, but something told me she was around my age. I heard a voice in my head as if from the other side of a bad phone connection." "What did it say?" Wesley asked, as if this was a perfectly natural occurrence. Bree hung her head. She said, "Go." "Go?" said Neil, "as in with us?" Bree nodded. "I stood up and shouted at her to leave me alone, and she was gone. But a second later, my legs went numb. Then my hands. The most incredible pain raced all over my body, like knives cutting my skin. I couldn't breathe, and everything started to go dark." Her voice hitched, but she continued. "I heard her voice again, as if from far away, screaming, 'Go!' So I promised I would. I said it out loud, and it stopped. She left me alone." Suddenly, furious, Bree turned toward the back seat. "I hate this, Neil. What have you gotten us into?" A half hour later, Eric continued north on the twisted country roads that led to the town of Heaverhill, where Whispering Knoll Rest Home was located. "I forgot to tell Aunt Claire we were leaving," said Bree, clutching her hands on her lap. "Me too," said Neil, feeling lightheaded. This was the first thing she said to him since yelling at him, but it gave him no comfort. "If they give you a hard time," said Eric, "I'll tell your aunts I'm a really good driver." "Thanks," Bree answered dryly. "I'm sure that'll help." Stone-faced, she glanced out the window at the immense green fields that sped by in a dizzying blur. The mountainous horizon from which they'd come faded in the humid air behind them. Despite the car's open windows, Neil's forehead was dripping with sweat, and his teeth nearly chattered with nerves. "How much longer?" Wesley asked. As if in response, a small white sign appeared along the side of the road up ahead. "Welcome to Heaverhill." After another couple miles, they came to another sign, this one for the rest home. Neil clutched at his seatbelt as Eric made the turn into the long driveway. The building was nice, or at least it was nicer than Neil had expected. He'd heard nursing homes could be depressing, but Whispering Knoll looked like a giant dollhouse, with gables and spires and white vinyl siding that resembled real wood. After parking, the four approached the main entrance. A pair of dark glass doors slid open. The group went in together, silent and curious. A quiet desk, covered in colorful flowers, stood off to the right of a wide foyer. A short woman greeted them with a fake-looking smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "We're here to see Jana Riley," said Neil. "I called earlier, but she was sleeping." "And you are?" the woman asked, waiting for him to finish the sentence. "Friends," said Bree. Neil was glad that she had his back. "Came up for a visit." The woman behind the desk sighed heavily, as if they'd asked her to run a marathon. She typed something into her computer. "Looks like she's scheduled for the rec room right now, but she's already got a visitor in there. Her son comes every afternoon." She glanced up at the group. Neil smiled, pretending to be unperturbed. "It'll be nice to see him too. Which way do we go?" The receptionist seemed surprised and a bit disappointed at his quick response, but pointed down the hall. "Straight ahead. Can't miss it." Wesley leaned toward the desk. "And, could you tell us what she looks like?" Bree smacked Wesley on the back. He cried out, and Bree forced a laugh. The receptionist wore a look that said she might call security. "Such a kidder," Bree said. The group hurried off toward a pair of friends' doors. "Smooth move, guys," Eric said. "I was just trying to help," said Wesley. The rec room was large, bright, and comfy. Soft couches were set up, facing each other in several areas. On an enormous television in the far corner, a muted game show played. A pool table stood in the center of the room, flanked by two unoccupied ping-pong tables. Most of the residents who were there seemed happy to simply sit near the sunny windows, enjoying the view of a sloping green hillside. A middle-aged man, younger than most of the people in the room, walked briskly toward them. Neil worried that the man was about to kick them out, but he passed them by. Neil, Bree, Wesley, and Eric were now alone with a group of elderly people. Slowly, the four stepped forward. Two women sat off to the left of the space, engaging in what sounded like a deep conversation about the weather. One man held onto a walker, staring silently out the window. A fourth woman was perched in a wheelchair. Her back was toward them. An empty chair sat beside her. Neil thought of the man who'd passed them at the center of the room. The receptionist's news that Mrs. Riley had a visitor, the chair that seemed to wait for someone's return. He approached this woman, her broad shoulders greeting him like a wall, her thin gray hair cut short, styled in massed curls. "Mrs. Riley?" he said. She turned and saw the group standing behind her. Her face was weathered, her laugh lines deep. Her bottom lip quavered, and for a moment Neil wondered if she was crying, but she wasn't. The movement seemed to be a spasm. It ended when the woman showed a smile that lit up her blue eyes. "Yes," she said. "My name is Neil Cady," he said, keeping his voice even, though his insides trembled. Imagining how someone on a detective show might sound, he said, "This is my sister Bree and my friends Wesley and Eric. We were wondering if we could talk to you for a few minutes." "About what?" she asked, her brow crinkling. "About Graylock Hall," said Neil. The words fell from his mouth like a stone into water. They seemed to ripple through the room, slowly making their way to the old woman's ears. When Xanon Riley finally processed what he said, her smile dropped away, and those bright blue eyes seemed to cloud over, as if a storm were brewing somewhere deep inside. Chapter 28. "What about it?" Mrs. Riley asked, but her puckered face told them she knew exactly what they wanted to hear. She sighed and rolled her eyes. "Sit down," she said, as if she'd been dreading this moment for many years. "Quick, before my son gets back." The four grabbed several stools from a nearby card table and arranged them around the old woman's wheelchair. When they were settled, Neil felt as if they were attending some sort of messed up story time at his hometown library back in New Jersey. "You wanted to see Nurse Janet for yourselves?" Mrs. Riley's face grew darker, angrier. "Isn't that how the story goes? Old Janet Riley, the monster of Graylock Hall?" She leaned toward Wesley as close as she could get. Her breath was orange-scented. Even Neil could smell her from where he sat. "Aren't you scared of me?" she whispered, a lightning flash in her eye. Anger, amusement. She was difficult to read. "Should we be?" asked Eric, crossing his arms, refusing to play her game. Mrs. Riley sat back and took him in. After a few seconds, she exhaled, releasing her intensity like steam from a kettle of boiling water. "Of course not," she said honestly. "I never hurt anyone in my life. So why do you kids insist on turning me into a monster?" "That's not what we came to do," said Bree. "If you tell us about Graylock," Neil tried, "we can share the truth with our friends." "The truth?" Mrs. Riley laughed a humorless laugh. "You came here, so you must know the story. Though I doubt your version has much to do with the truth." She shrugged. "Short version, some patients died while under my watch. The town blamed me." She paused again. "They said that I was responsible." "But you're not," Bree whispered. "That's the big question, isn't it?" Mrs. Riley answered, more softly than any of them expected. "You want the truth?" She coughed, cleared her throat, and then shook her head, which appeared heavy, weary with memory. "The truth is, the patients did it to themselves, honey. Remember, those kids were not well. They had emotional problems, addictions, difficult families. These were good kids who needed help. They deserved the best kind of treatment, but what they got was Graylock, and they wanted out. All knew that when the summer storms come through that place," she continued, looking each of them in the eye in return, "the island's power grid usually failed, and the back door of the youth ward would unlatch. I begged my bosses to get it fixed, but considering the condition of the rest of the building, one little broken door didn't seem to be high on their list of priorities, even after the second time it happened. The investigations, the accusations, the poor patients." The old woman sighed. "That's so horrible," said Bree, shivering beneath the air-conditioning vent. "I worked the graveyard shift alone," Mrs. Riley went on. "Unlucky enough to be in the position where my kids were capable of sneaking out from under my watch. And let me tell you, when the lights went out in that building, it was all I could do to keep track of myself, never mind 15 teenagers no older than the lot of you." "So the drownings really were accidents?" said Neil. He thought of the nightmare he'd had, running through the woods, falling into the lake, trapped under the surface, inhaling water. He knew it had been a dream because he'd been asleep, but upon waking it had seemed so very much like a memory, as if it had really happened, as if he'd been one of the patients. There was a big difference between Mrs. Riley's explanation and what he'd seen. In the dream, someone had been chasing him. Mrs. Riley clutched at the arms of her chair, her eyes suddenly wild. Don't think I haven't blamed myself every day for what happened. It hurts. To fail those in your care despite your best intentions. To have an entire community turn against you. To have friends and family wondering, is it true? Is it capable of such an atrocity? She calmed herself, glancing at her audience as if they suddenly materialized all around her. I'm sorry, you didn't come to hear this. We did actually, said Eric. And we're sorry, Bree added. It must have been horrible for you. Mrs. Riley nodded. Deep down, they may have known I was no villain. Her words now seemed to bubble forth uncontainable. I believe with my heart and soul that the people of Hedston never wanted to blame me alone, but who else did they have to blame? No one else was there. Again, Neil had a feeling he was wrong. Someone was there, the person who chased him in his dream. Still, Mrs. Riley sniffed, disgusted at her recollection. No one did a thing to help. No one spoke up in my defense. How much easier had it been for them to run me out of town than to attack a mundane evil, the kind that is born of neglect and denial. So you moved away, said Wesley carefully. Did you ever go back to Heston? No, said Mrs. Riley. Why should I, when the memory of that town has followed me all these years? Even now, I'm there. She blinked, as if forcing herself back into her body. I believe we must all share the guilt for the tragedies that occurred at Graylock Hall. If I'm a demon, then so was everyone who sat back and did nothing while that building fell apart with those poor people in it. She reached out and grabbed Neil's wrist. Her fingers were cold. He stiffened, but forced himself not to pull away. You said you'd tell your friends the truth. Neil nodded, staring at her trembling lip. Promise, she whispered. Mom? The man had returned. He stood just outside of the small powwow circle. Are you okay? Mrs. Riley glanced at her son as if coming out of a dream. Oh, Nicholas, are you done with your call? All set, said the man, his hands in the pockets of his black jeans. He looked at the group, realization dawning in his eyes. His brow darkened, his bloodshot eyes filled with loathing. Neil felt the room start to spin. It would all be over in a moment. He patted the old woman's hand. I promise, he said. I do, but I have one more question. He knew he had to spit out this next part, or else it would lodge in his throat. Do you believe in ghosts? Nicholas Riley stepped forward. Raising his voice, he said, What's this about? Ghosts? Mrs. Riley asked, confused. She dropped Neil's hand. What kind of ghosts? Neil glanced at her son, whose chest seemed to be growing larger. We've been seeing a girl. You're kidding, said Nicholas. Not a girl! How terrifying for you! Bree spoke up, ignoring him. Do any of these things mean anything to you? She mentioned the deer antlers, the piano bends, the white logs in the fireplace. Mrs. Riley only stammered, Not that I can recall. Why? Nicholas grabbed the handles on the back of his mother's wheelchair. Let's get you back up to your room. You've had enough excitement for one day. Well, I'd like to have some more, if you don't mind, Mrs. Riley said, glancing up at her son. As he pushed her chair away, she reached out and grabbed his arm. I want to ask them something. Nicholas sighed, but turned the chair around so that Mrs. Riley faced the group once more. Where are you from? She asked. Neil stood up. He suddenly felt terrible about barging into the nursing home. He owed her an explanation. Bree and I are visiting our aunts in Hedston for the summer. Wesley and Eric live there too. We heard the stories. We were curious to meet you. Sorry, we didn't mean to cause any trouble. Mrs. Riley nodded, seeming to forget how upset she'd been moments earlier. I do like guests. I don't get nearly enough of them. Nicholas rolled his eyes. Your visit was a surprise, but I'm happy to set the record straight. She smiled at each of them. Then she tilted her head and glanced around the space. Where's the other one? She asked. Neil, Bree, Wesley, and Eric looked at one another in confusion. What other one? Neil asked. Mrs. Riley sat up straight, grabbing the wheels of her chair and turning herself around, taking in all of the room. Nicholas stepped back. The other girl you came in with, she was just here. She let go of the wheels and drifted a few inches forward. My sight isn't too good, but I'm sure she had long dark hair, dressed in white, never said a word. Neil grabbed at his sister's hand. Bree squeezed back. He felt the same way he had back in room 13, when the ghostly shape had begun to appear in the darkness. His stomach lurched. He wanted to run, but to where? From what? The old woman looked toward the group, concern filling her watery blue eyes. She was so familiar to me. Where did she go? Chapter 29. They rode home in silence. If Mrs. Riley believed that there had been another girl with them, then the seat between Bree and Neil would have to be where she now sat. They both made an effort to keep their distance from it. Neil crossed his legs tightly, and Bree hung on to the handle above the car door. When they passed back into Hedston, Wesley spoke up. At least he was nice. Nice, said Eric. Who cares if she was nice? Nice doesn't mean she's not guilty. You really think that little old lady was capable of killing those kids? Bree asked. She wasn't always a little old lady, said Eric. Did you see the size of her shoulders? It doesn't really matter, does it? Said Neil, pressing himself against the door, far away from that center seat. Someone or something is haunting me and Bree. We might have had a chance to stop the haunts when we assumed the ghost was Nurse Riley, but we had little information. But now we're back at square one. If something followed us home from Graylock, how do we figure out what it is? We looked at the clues, Wesley suggested. Which are? Asked Eric. The 3 pictures that keep popping up, for one, said Bree. The antlers, piano bench, and the firewood. That doesn't seem like a lot to go on, said Eric, turning onto Tully Avenue toward the pie shop. And there's no guarantee that those pictures you guys keep seeing have anything to do with Graylock. It might all be a coincidence. The group snuck into the shop through the back door, but Neil was barely past the threshold when he heard Claire's voice. You were gone for quite some time, she called out. Nearly jumping out of his skin, Neil turned with the others to see his aunt at the office desk. She went on. I thought we were going to ask before taking out from now on. Neil didn't know what to say. He knew they'd broken her rule, but he'd been hoping to find her so occupied that she wouldn't notice. Her head wobbled slightly, like their moms did when she was about to explode. Well, what do you have to say for yourselves? Blame me, Claire, said Eric. I had my mother's car. I wanted them to come for a ride. We were too far away before they realized they forgot to ask. You could have called. Neil stepped forward. We're sorry. Are you truly? Because you only look scared. She was right. Neil was terrified. He wanted desperately to tell her what had been happening, but she was more frightened about what might happen if she and Anna sent him away. Claire sighed. I don't blame you. Everything must seem scary right now. Change is hard. She shook her head. Duh. I've been too busy to keep you too busy enough. I want you to have fun up here, and I don't want you to feel like prisoners, so just don't tell your Aunt Anna that I lost track of you. That's better than the alternative, don't you think? Neil felt as if she shot him in the stomach. He knew what the alternative was. sipping him off to another relative. Perhaps seeing the pain in Neil's face, Claire quickly changed the subject. I only noticed you late because your father called here looking to speak with you guys. He called? Bree said, perking up. Did he say anything? Only that he knows he's a real jerk for not phoning sooner. She smiled, seeming to take pleasure in calling him that. Neil grinned, too. And that he'd try again tomorrow. Her smile dropped away as she added, Bree, did you tell him that you didn't want to stay with us anymore? Bree's cheeks flushed red. I only meant that maybe somewhere closer to home might be easier for all of us. Said Clara, clearly hurt. Well, if that's what you guys want. It's not what I want, said Neil. We'll talk about it later, Claire said, turning back to her computer. Neil couldn't tell if she was still upset. Shop's closing soon. Anna's cooking. Hungry? Chapter 30. At dinner, Anna asked everyone about their day. Bree and Neil looked at each other, while Claire conspicuously shoved a fork full of spinach into her mouth. It was interesting, said Bree. We learned a lot. About? Anna asked, her eyebrows dancing. Somehow she always managed to look at them with suspicion. Pah! Claire mumbled. Right, guys? Neil smiled. It wasn't a total fabrication. After they'd all cleared the dining table and scrubbed the dishes in the sink, the aunts decided to light the citronella torches in the backyard, and they invited Neil and Bree to sit outside, eat ice cream, and watch the sky. There's supposed to be a meteor shower this weekend, said Anna, following Claire out the door. Last year's was spectacular. The falling stars inspired a whole batch of my pottery. If it's okay with you all, said Bree, I'm going to relax upstairs. Standing out in the dimly lit yard, the aunts glanced at each other, obviously concerned. And they don't know the half of it, thought Neil. It had been a strange day. He certainly didn't trust his own brain to behave, so did he trust his sister's? But by the time he turned back, Bree had disappeared into the house, and he felt he had no choice but to follow Claire and Anna. As the three sat in the metal lawn furniture out back, the chirping of the crickets and tree frogs became so loud that the ants' conversation was nearly drowned out. Neil didn't care. He wasn't listening anyway. The world vibrated all around him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt somewhat okay in it. No need to escape in stories. No need to hide away in legends. Back at the house, the sound of running water came from an upstairs window. Bree was taking an evening bath, a habit she'd had since he could remember. He forced the memory of his own traumatic bathtub experience out of his mind. He licked voraciously at the cone that Aunt Anna had prepared for him, trying to catch the mint chocolate chip ice cream before it leaked down onto his fingers. For the first time all summer, Neil allowed himself to think of his mother. He wondered where she was right now. A month ago, he would have been sitting on her bed with her, her face smashed into a damp pillow, her blonde hair sprawled like a cobweb halo. He would have stroked her back as she held in the sobs he knew she'd hidden from him when he'd entered the room. Whenever he found her like that, he didn't know what to do. She'd ask him not to tell anyone how she was feeling, but it had gotten harder and harder, especially when she seemed too tired to even lift her head to glance at him. Alexei and Mark said that ghosts don't like things to change. A haunting might simply be a soul's inability to make peace with the past. Ghosts can't see forward, they only look back, just like his mom. It seems silly to call the police because your mother was too sad. He would have done just that if Bree hadn't called their father instead and told him what was going on. Neil was almost excited at the prospect of his father having to come home and finally deal with the situation. But when Neil learned his father's solution, that he and Bree would stay with the ants, he'd felt as if his head might explode with anger. Looking up from his cone, Neil was surprised to see his ants dancing like hippies in the torchlight. There was no music except for their laughter. They twirled and raised their arms to the speckled sky, as if calling for the stars to fall. When they noticed Neil watching, they ran to him and pulled him up, causing his cone to drop into the grass. He began to protest, but when Anna spun him, he relented, becoming entranced by her giddiness. She clasped his shoulders, bringing him to a halt. Then, with one finger, she raised his chin. "Look," she whispered. Dozens of white streaks, each lasting less than a second, dashed across the dark dome above them. Neil felt something strange move inside his head, a buzzing type of burn. Then, before he knew it, his eyes filled with tears, and all the stars crashed in one big blur. A scream filled the night. It took Neil a moment to realize where it came from. The ants turned toward the house, too. The light in the upstairs bathroom looked stark, alone. "Help me!" Bree cried out before screaming again. When the sound of her voice cut off abruptly, Neil was jolted out of his trance. He forgot the stars, forgot his mother, forgot everything, and ran toward the dark house. Chapter 31. He quickly reached the back steps, the door, the kitchen, the foyer, the stairs, the hallway, the bathroom. Neil tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded the door as hard as he could, rattling the surprisingly strong wood. "Bree?" He pictured his sister on the other side, sprawled on the floor, a pool of blood spreading out on the tile below her cracked skull, the window smashed, a blur of white, someone slipping outside into the night. "Bree!" he shouted again, so loud that his throat hurt. Neil felt a presence behind him and turned to find the ants hurrying to catch up. Claire and Anna picked up the shouting where he'd left off. "Bree, honey, open the door!" Seconds ticked by. Neil began to feel numb, pins and needles creeping up his arms from the tips of his fingers, like poison spreading toward his heart. He heard Claire say something. Should we break it down? But he didn't know who she was speaking to. "Bree!" He tried again, calling his sister's name so hard he thought it might break. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice came, softly. "Yes?" Bree answered. Neil and his aunts were so stunned, none of them spoke for several seconds. Eventually, Claire managed to ask, "Is everything okay in there?" Neil clenched his jaw. How many times had he heard that question over the past few days? There was a rustling at the knob, then the door opened a crack. Neil pushed it ajar, accidentally knocking it into his sister. "Hey!" she said. "What's it?" She stood beside the draining bathtub, a plush pink towel wrapped around her torso, her brown hair stuck to her forehead. "Ever hear of privacy?" "What were you screaming about?" Neil asked. His heart was still knocking in his chest and would probably keep going on that way for the rest of the night. Bree glanced at the bathtub. Expressionlessly, she said, "I fell asleep. I had a dream." Met by horrified stares, she seemed to suddenly understand the havoc she'd created. "Sorry." Anna stepped forward, peering into the bathroom, as if she too wondered whether Bree was really alone in there. "You can't do that, honey," she said. "Fall asleep in the bathtub. Don't you realize you could have drowned?" Bree maintained those cool eyes, that thin smile. "No, I guess I didn't realize," she sighed. Neil heard a slight trembling in her chest as her breath escaped her lungs. "Look, I'm really sorry. I won't do it again. Showers only for me from now on, okay?" Claire shook her head, then reached out and stroked Bree's wet head. Bree stepped back, and when Claire pulled her hand away, a long green strand stretched off from Bree's hair. Wide-eyed, Bree snatched the lakeweed from her aunt's grip, crumpling it up and hiding it behind her. "What the heck is that?" asked Anna. Bree blinked, looking numb. "A special scalp treatment keeps my hair really glossy." Chapter 32. Later that night, after everyone had found their way to their bedrooms, Neil lay looking at the ceiling above his bed until he was certain the rest of the house had finally gone dark. Then he pulled his sheets back and crept to the door. The hallway was a mess of shadows, but he managed to find his way to Bree's room. He didn't knock. Pushing open the door, Neil gasped. Bree was sitting on top of her bedspread in the darkness. Light shined through the window, up from the porch lamp below, marking a dim yellow swatch on the ceiling and softly illuminating her face. Bree watched Neil watching her, as if she had expected him to come. He closed the door and made his way to the end of her bed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Really?" Bree shook her head, and Neil climbed up next to her. "What happened? What did you see?" Bree turned to the window. Neil waited. After what felt like a long time, she said, "I never realized before I came to Headston how very sad ghost stories are." "Sad?" Bree nodded. "Those ghostly investigators you love so much, they're always getting rid of the spirits, banishing them, or whatever they call it. Like during the episode we watched the other night, those two guys came swaggering into that place and started telling the people who lived around there that all they had to do was demand the ghosts leave, and the people were happy that they could get on with their lives." Bree looked up from the blanket, right into Neil's eyes. "But what about the ghosts?" "I don't understand." "Don't you feel sorry for the ghosts?" "Not particularly," said Neil. This was just like her, to have sympathy for the bad guy. She was the same way about their father. "Not when they're doing awful things." Bree shook her head. "Those investigator people talk about ghosts like they're monsters or something," she said, wiping at her eyes. "Creatures that need to be defeated when, really, they're humans, with memories and wishes and fears. And I know that the spirit who followed us home from Graylock has been doing bad things, but she's been doing them for a reason." Neil felt chills crash like an ocean wave on his back, but he still didn't know what to say. Bree leaned forward, pulled her damp hair behind her ears. Tonight in the bathtub, I didn't fall asleep like I told the ants." "Yeah, I figured that." "I was lying in the water, rinsing my hair, when all of a sudden I couldn't sit up. Something was holding me down. It felt like a rope was being wrapped around my neck." "Like in the dream we both had the other night?" said Neil, his breath coming out quickly. Bree nodded. "It wasn't rope, it was the lakeweed." "I opened my eyes," he said. "They stung, but I could see that I wasn't in the bathtub anymore. All around me was a kind of darkness that I can't even describe. It was bigger than just the lake. It felt huge, like outer space. I could see a light shining on me from above. Someone was standing on the shore. Watching, I scrambled to reach out to the person, but I couldn't move. The weeds held me. I started to scream. Finally, the person crept closer, but instead of helping me, their hands pressed me deeper into the water. I choked. I thought I might die. The pins and needles came. It was the most horrifying pain. I remembered something I heard in biology class. It hurts like that when you're drowning." Bree hugged herself, shuddering the thought away. "Then I was back in the bathroom, sitting up, gasping. Moments later I heard you pounding on the door. I tried to compose myself. I didn't want to scare the ants." "You weren't very convincing," Neil said, trying to smile. "These visions are getting worse," said Bree. "We already learned that the ghost who followed us home from Graylock Hall wasn't Nurse Shannon. The ghost is one of the patients who drowned in the lake. What happened wasn't an accident. The girl was murdered." Bree took Neil's hand and squeezed. "All these bad things she's not doing to hurt us. She's showing us what happened. She wants us to figure out who killed her." Chapter 33. In the morning, Neil called Wesley in a panic. "Come over," he begged. "I need your help." By the time Wesley pulled into the driveway on his bike, Claire and Anna had disappeared into the barn to clean and organize. It was Sunday. Both of the aunts had taken the day off, so Neil and Bree didn't have to follow either of them into town. Bree'd been quiet since breakfast, so Neil decided to let her be. Upstairs, she'd picked up her viola for the first time since coming to Hedston. He knew she must be contemplating their late-night conversation. Music helped her think. She practiced her scales, sliding her fingers up and down the chord progressions faster and faster, the music sounding like a swarm of panicked bees. The boys sat on the front porch, and Neil filled Wesley in. "Wow," said Wesley afterward. "So your sister thinks the spirit is pointing you toward a killer?" He glanced around, bracing himself against the chill that wasn't there. "What if the killer's still alive?" Wesley spoke slowly, his voice filled with worry. "Say you find out who did it." "We go to the police." "And tell them what?" Neil shook his head, unsure. "You know I'm into this stuff as much as you are," said Wesley, clenching his hands nervously, "but it sounds dangerous." Neil stared at the ground at the bottom of the steps. A warm wind rustled the front lawn. He remembered what Bree had said the night before about all ghost stories being sad, about putting himself in their shoes. For some reason, her comment made him think of his mother, her crying fits, the way she'd insisted she felt alone even as he sat right beside her. He understood now what was happening here. A desperate soul, lost in a downward spiral, had found him, asking for his help. Neil hadn't been able to give it to his mother. In fact, he'd practically run away from her. Now was his chance to do something right. "I'm sorry," said Wesley. I don't want anyone to get hurt, and that's all." Neil glanced at the wilted gauze taped to his shin. "You didn't seem to care about that a couple days ago when you told me about Graylock." He didn't mean to sound unkind, but Wesley still crossed his arms. "That was different," said Wesley. "It was supposed to be fun. Things have changed." He was quiet for a few moments. Thoughts of the dead girl seemed to fill the air between the boys. Maybe she was here now, listening. "We could try to communicate with her. Maybe she'll go ahead and tell us what she needs to know. I have a Ouija board at home, or we could do automatic writing." "I don't know about that. If she could tell us everything, don't you think she already would have?" asked Neil, shaking his head. "I feel like this girl must be new at this. She's learning. She can't talk, so she haunts. She's frightened, so she shows us what scares her. She comes when we're most capable of seeing her, at night, in dreams when our minds are open. She actually brought me and Bree to the moment of her death." "Great," said Wesley. "So if this girl drowns you, I'll remember to tell everyone she didn't mean it." Neil shook his head, not in the mood for jokes. "All this is only a piece of the puzzle, and you're right, the bigger picture is scarier. Someone killed her at Graylock Hall. Someone who may still be out there." The cherry-colored music of Bree's viola drifted out from the window above him, mixing with the breeze, floating off into the woods. Neil hugged his legs close. His own touch stung slightly, a reminder of his last trip into the woods. That has to be where the answers lie. Chapter 34. Neil walked to the trees at the back of the aunt's property. Wesley reluctantly followed. It would be easier for them to sneak away while Bree played the viola. If anyone asked, they would say they were simply looking for one of those ancient New England rock walls the old farmers had left behind centuries ago, before the lands had changed hands and the fields had become forest. As the foliage enveloped the view of the large Victorian house behind them, Neil began to feel queasy. Was he really about to do this again? What if the dead girl showed him exactly what he needed to know? And what if he didn't want to know it anymore? Out here, surrounded by a camouflage of green, where animals hid and watched and possibly stalked, all his talk about doing something was leaking out of him like air from a punctured bicycle tire. "You coming?" said Wesley, crouching through the brush ahead. "Right behind you," said Neil, ignoring the tremors in his gut. And then there was Graylock. The boys helped each other underneath the fence, strolled across the bridge and down the long walk onto the island. When they came around the corner of the building toward the place where they had last entered, that broken basement window, they were surprised to find boards covering the opening. Fresh, glimmering nails penetrated through the new planks into the old window's frame. "Someone knew we were here," said Wesley. "Yeah," said Neil. "Looks like they didn't want us to come back." "I'm not sure which is worse," said Wesley. "A killer ghost or a killer killer? Maybe we should take the hint." Neil peered back past the rows of pines toward the bridge. No one appeared to have followed them, but that didn't necessarily mean the boys were alone. Wesley was right. Maybe this was too dangerous. An odd sensation began to tingle at Neil's toes. It was a numbing feeling, the beginnings of a dead limb, like when you kneel down and cut off the blood supply to your feet. The girl was nearby, and she wanted them to keep going. What else would she do to spark them onward? Choke them? Blind them? Tangle them in lakeweed? Before he could think too much, Neil tugged Wesley's sleeve, pulling him further along. "The youth warden's this way, right?" Wesley dragged his heels. After a long walk, just before the tip of the land met the dark water of the lake, the boys found a broken patio. A half moon of concrete radiated out from the building. Flowering weeds had grown tall through the cracks in the pavement, obscuring some old hopscotch paint below, a rudimentary sort of playground. Looking up at the building, Neil recognized the tall windows that stared back at him. The youth ward was on the other side. In the wall to their right was a door. Neil stepped upon the clingy green stalks and made his way to the entry, remembering what Mrs. Riley had said about this door being broken all the time. He reached out and clasped the handle. When he pulled, the rusted hinges screamed. The darkness inside had been waiting for him. He turned around to find Wesley staring at him, exuding unease. The boys said nothing as they stepped over the threshold. They walked quickly up the steps that led to the main room. Neil pushed open the wire mesh door. The cake still sat on the table to his right. The air was musty. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. "Now what?" asked Wesley. He glanced at the ceiling, wearing a look of concern. He obviously did not want to go upstairs. Neil shared his fear. "We saw the girl in room 13. Maybe she'll appear there again." Wesley shook his head. "She only appeared because he was able to draw from your batteries, your flashlight, and your camera." Neil sighed. They'd left the aunt's house in such a hurry, they hadn't considered that the spirit might need another energy source in order to communicate with them. "Maybe we should poke around down here instead then. Save me another bloody nose. Where did Eric find that file folder he took last time?" Wesley nodded at the closed door in the opposite wall, the one beside the cake table. "He came from there, remember?" A small window provided enough light to show them that the room was a small office. A nursing station, perhaps. A desk was shoved in a corner, piled with junk. Folders, a typewriter, a bulky stapler. Tall wooden filing cabinets lined every wall. "The patient's information is all here," Neil said, "or at least information on the ones who lived in this section of the hospital. Maybe we can find the files of the girls who died." "We didn't even know their names," said Wesley. "When I looked online, I couldn't come up with anything specific about the death, something about confidentiality." Neil caught sight of a metallic object glinting on the desk, buried slightly by dusty office supplies. The object was sharp. A knife, maybe? He crept closer. When he touched the tip of it, a wave of release rushed over him, followed quickly by another one of disappointment. It was only a letter opener. "Check this out," Wesley said. He pointed to the large pad of paper on which the opener was lying. "A calendar. Maybe someone wrote something down, something we can use." Worth a peek, I guess. The boys cleared away as much stuff as possible so that they had a complete view of the calendar. The yellowed page showed June from 20 years ago. There were several pencil markings, but most were so faint they were barely legible. Neil leaned close and squinted, trying to read them. Karen B's birthday, he said, pointing to the box marked with the number 5. That must be the party that happened out in the common room. Wesley sighed. Does that mean we should be looking in the files for a Karen B? It couldn't hurt. Wesley shrugged. I don't know about you, Neil, but this is starting to feel like an impossible... He stopped, turning his head toward the door. Neil stepped closer to him. What's wrong? Wesley waved him quiet. I heard something. Then Neil heard it too. The hinges that had screamed at them from the door downstairs were whining now. The boys weren't alone here after all. Neil stepped toward the doorway, but Wesley held the back of his shirt, shaking his head. Neil had no intention of walking into the main room. He simply wanted to shut the office door, to hide. The small window on the opposite side of the room presented the option of a fall to the grass below. Was it worth the risk of breaking his neck? Peering around the edge of the door, Neil heard footsteps. Wesley clutched Neil's hand as they both watched the top of a head rise past the lip of the stairs inside the cage. Long dark hair, messy, covering her face. A girl in a dirty white dress. Neil remembered a horror novel he'd read several years ago in which a couple of kids were haunted by a gang of evil girls who looked similar to the one rising up before him. But this wasn't a character from a book. Wesley pulled Neil back just as the girl reached for the cage door. They backed up against the desk, knocking into a pile of folders. To their horror, the pile wobbled. It fell, as if in slow motion, and they scrambled to catch whatever they could, but it was too late. The folders fell to the floor, sliding across the room in a straight line, one on top of another, like dominoes, toward the office entrance. The boys held their breath as the sound of the cage door slammed in the main room. Then a soft voice whispered, Neil? Wesley, is that you? Chapter 35. For a moment, Neil was thrilled and terrified. The ghosts knew their names. She'd spoken to them. Then, as his brain began to work again, he came back down to earth. Bree? He called out grudgingly. Footsteps sped toward him, echoing in the other room like gunshots. Then his sister's face was in the doorway. She was panting, out of breath. She did not look happy. What are you two doing in here? I could ask you the same question, Neil shot back. You left me at home. Bree stepped into the room, standing on the pile of folders that had sprawled on the floor. Sorry, said Neil. I didn't want to make a scene. I saw you head into the woods behind the barn. I didn't think you'd actually come in here again. Are you insane? If he's insane, said Wesley, we're all insane. Neil looked around. The evidence of the building's history piled up everywhere. We need to help her. The word her hung between them like the humming of a struck bell. After a moment, Bree shook her head. No, we don't. What we need to do is ignore all of this and go. Come on. After everything we talked about last night, after everything you said? Bree closed her eyes. A glimmer of guilt wrinkled her forehead. Yeah, well, I gave it some more thought, and I realized that my sanity and my safety are more important than helping some dead girl I've never met. Neil clenched his jaw. You're lying. Bree glared at him. I know you. I've seen how much this is bothering you. She crossed her arms. Her face told him that he was right. A metallic squeal sounded from the common room, followed by a loud bang. The three froze, standing wide-eyed in the office. You came alone, right? Wesley whispered to Bree. She nodded sharply. That queasy feeling gurgled in Neil's stomach again. He thought of sharp metal objects glinting in gloved hands carried by a killer. Trying to calm himself down, he said, there might be a simple explanation. Then he stepped forward, twisting away from his sister's grasp, and forced himself to peek out the door. One of the chairs had toppled over, as if someone had kicked it away from the cake table, but that was not what captured Neil's attention. On the floor between the table and the door, a thick brown folder was splayed open. He glanced back at the files that had toppled from the desk. The stray folder sat another 10 feet or so from the rest. Could it have slid all the way there? Bree and Wesley came up behind Neil to see what had happened. Neil pointed at the folder near the table. "Was that her when you came in?" he asked his sister. Blank-faced, Bree shook her head. Neil glanced around, making sure no one was hiding under the table, waiting to grab his ankle. Bending down, he examined the folder. He read the name on the tab. Rebecca Smith? He stood and held the folder out so they all could look at it. He flipped through several pages, which appeared to be doctor's notes, test results, medication forms. Finally, Wesley spoke up. "We came here looking for answers. I think someone just gave us a whole bunch." Chapter 36. When they got back to the Ann's house, Bree ran upstairs ahead of the boys to change out of the white dress she'd put on that morning. It had gotten dirty during the impromptu excursion. Luckily, Claire and Anna were still distracted in the barn. Sounds of the Grateful Dead blasted out from the workshop. Neil felt a pang of guilt as he strolled by the open door. Maybe they weren't the best custodians or caretakers or whatever people wanted to call them, but he knew the ants cared. Carrying the file, Neil and Wesley came around to the front porch, where they laid their prize open between them. Bree sat down beside him before he turned a single page. Maybe all she needed were further hard facts and fewer frightening visions. Maybe he saw their mom somewhere in all this mess. Either way, her new attitude gave Neil hope that they'd made the right decision in going back to Graylock. "Look!" said Wesley, pointing at the top sheet. "Her name, birthday, and the date of her admission to the hospital." Neil reached out and turned the page, and much more, much more. Some pages were clearly missing from the file. Others were stained, water damaged to the point of illegibility. But there was still a lot of information to take in. As they sat and read, time swallowed the afternoon. The life of Rebecca Smith filled their heads. According to the file, Rebecca had been 17 years old when she first came to Graylock with severe depression. She'd asked to be admitted to the youth ward because she thought she'd be safer there. Safe from whom, she didn't say, but the doctors inferred she'd be safe from herself. What little information the doctors were able to get from Rebecca revealed that her childhood had been fairly normal, unremarkable. Then, at 15, Rebecca's mother was hit by a car while walking on the side of the road. After the funeral, Rebecca found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep. When she woke in the morning, she would be overcome by a sense of panic that something horrible was going to happen. Within weeks, Rebecca had slipped far away into her head. At Graylock, Rebecca eventually began to socialize with some of the other patients in the youth ward. After a few months, the staff claimed she might even benefit from being released. For Rebecca, this news was devastating. She withdrew into her bedroom, number 13, rarely coming out except for meals and meetings, during which she refused to speak. "That's the room we got stuck in," said Bree, her voice quavering. "It's her," Neil whispered. "Rebecca's our ghost." "Exactly," said Wesley, shaking his head in disbelief. "So what was wrong? If she was getting better, why didn't Rebecca want to leave Graylock?" "Maybe she was scared of what she might do to herself," said Bree. "Or maybe she was scared of what someone else might do to her," Neil whispered. "Look here," said Wesley, peeking ahead to the last of the pages. "It turned out that Graylock wasn't the safest place for her after all. She died there. She was one of the girls who drowned in the lake. The file proved it." The three of them looked over the copy of the coroner's report. Bree covered her mouth and closed her eyes. "She was only a little older than me." The front door swung inward, and the three of them jumped. Neil swiftly closed the folder and sat on it. "Hey there," said Claire from behind the screen door. "What you been up to?" "Not much," said Neil, "just hanging out." Claire bit the inside of her mouth as if she didn't like that answer. Anyone up for a trip to Bruce's Drive-In? I don't know about you all, but I'm hungry enough for a hot dog or two. My treat. Neil and Bree glanced at each other, silently questioning whether they had time for a break. They have go-karts, said Wesley, as if that might seal the deal. Chapter 37. After a greasy dinner of hot dogs and french fries, they all raced go-karts, taking the curve slowly so that none of them vomited. The ants dared Neil to wallop them, but even after a few trips around the track, he couldn't stop thinking of Graylock. It was as if Rebecca was sitting next to him, pulling at the steering wheel. When the group returned to the ants' house, the sun was starting to set. With his bike helmet strapped on tightly and his lips pressed shut in a knowing smile, Wesley took off for home. A message waited on the answering machine in the foyer, the red light blinking from the console like a stop signal at a crossroad. When Neil heard his father's voice blaring from the speaker, he closed his eyes. "Hey guys, sorry to miss you again," said Rick. "I've got a big surprise that I'm sure will make you very happy. I'm busy tonight, but we'll talk in a couple days. Love to you all." Click. The ants sighed and went into the living room, giving Neil and Bree privacy in the foyer. "You want to call him back?" asked Neil. Bree shook her head. Her eyes glinted darkly, almost regretfully. "But there is someone I think we should try reaching out to." Bree grabbed the cordless phone and dialed information. "I'm looking for a phone number in Haverhill, New York," she said to the operator. "A nursing home called Whispering Knoll." Mrs. Riley had been there on the night Rebecca had drowned. They both agreed that they needed to ask her about it. Neil dialed the number Bree had written down. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He was about to hang up when a voice said, "Good evening. Whispering Knoll. How can I help you?" Neil asked to be connected to Mrs. Riley's room. After some hesitation, the receptionist told him to hold. After nearly a minute, a male voice came on the line. "Who is this?" Neil recognized Mrs. Riley's son. He didn't sound happy. My name is Neil Cady. I met you yesterday." As if he'd been waiting for the call, Nicholas interrupted. "My mother has nothing more to say to you, and if you keep bothering us, you're going to be very sorry. Do you understand me?" Neil nearly dropped the phone. All the breath exited his lungs. The line went dead, and moments later a dial tone rang in his ear. Neil put the phone back in the cradle. Bree leaned forward, eyes like flying saucers. "What happened? What did she say?" "He said I was going to be very sorry." Neil shook his head. "I don't think we should call there again." Chapter 38. Later upstairs, Neil and Bree sat on his bed, discouraged, flipping through the pages of Rebecca Smith's file. "I still can't believe Nurse Janet's son," said Bree. "So weird." "Yeah," said Neil, unsure if weird was the right word for what Nicholas Riley actually was. "I don't know. I keep thinking about the way he watched us when we went up to Whispering Knoll, like he wanted us to disappear or something." "He's trying to protect his mom," said Bree, distractedly turning another page of the folder, landing on a blood test report. She glanced up at Neil. "He doesn't want her to have to deal with any more Nurse Janet questions." Something popped into Neil's head, something he hadn't considered before. Maybe he's hiding something. Bree flinched. "Like what?" "Mrs. Riley could have lied," said Neil, sitting back against the pillows near his headboard. "If Nicholas knew that, what would he do to keep anyone from learning what really happened in Graylock Hall?" Bree pulled nervously on her hair. "You don't think—" She exhaled slowly, evenly. But for Neil, the room spun. "I don't know," he choked out. Nicholas's voice stuck in his head like caramel. He tried to remember his dream from the other night, to make out the face behind the flashlight chasing him through the woods. Could it have been Mrs. Riley after all? Maybe she actually was crazy, and maybe it ran in the family. "I wish Rebecca could just tell us what to do." Neil felt a chill. He glanced around the room. There was no breeze, and yet he was suddenly cold. Bree rubbed at her arms. The papers lying between them fluttered a bit. Neil and Bree both looked down, bringing their hands away from the folder. Something on the page caught his attention. "Bree," Neil whispered, "look." He pointed at a name typed near the top of the document. Dr. Julius Simon. According to the hospital record, the doctor who had ordered Rebecca's tests was the same one who'd bandaged Neil's leg. Neil drew back from the folder as if it might suddenly slam shut on his hand. Chapter 39. The next morning was cold and gray. A white mist filled the usually sunny spaces between the trees that surrounded the Victorian house in the woods. When Neil woke and glanced out his bedroom window, he imagined momentarily that the fog was a mass of apparitions congregating in the shadows, waiting to descend upon him. Vague memories of bad dreams stuck in his head like cobwebs in a long-forgotten attic. Coming downstairs, a name flashed in his brain, sucking away the last remnants of sleep. Julia Simon. Neil had suggested the night before that they reach out to the doctor today. Bree, however, was still on the fence about it. He might be dangerous, he argued. Neil was thankful to find the rest of his makeshift family sitting at the kitchen table. Claire asked Neil and Bree if they wouldn't mind helping out at the register since Lyle called out sick. The two quickly shared a look. Being in town would bring them closer to the doctor's office, but was that a good thing? By the time they got to the shop, the morning rush had already passed. Melissa Diaz had been able to cover until they arrived. Claire taught Neil and Bree how to ring up the customers, then went back to her office. Even with a steady trickle of customers, though, Neil couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Simon. Rebecca had obviously wanted them to find her file, but did she wish them to visit a doctor? Or avoid him at all costs? Either way, Dr. Simon was the only clue they had left. Returning to the front door after a bathroom break, Neil tapped his sister's shoulder. She screamed and spun around, her hand raised up as if ready to smack him. He flinched. "Whoa there," he said. "Jumpy?" Bree closed her eyes and shook her head. "You wouldn't believe what just happened." Neil raised his eyebrows. "I was standing here counting out the last customer's change when I looked up and noticed a car parked across the street. Guess who?" Neil shook his head. "Nicholas Riley." They both went out on the sidewalk, but the car that Bree had seen was gone. The roads were damp and fog obscured the distance. "How sure are you that it was him?" Neil asked. "Pretty sure," said Bree. "His eyes were shooting bullets." Neil didn't care for the expression. After all, what might the man do to protect his mother? "Going up to Heaverhill was a big mistake. We've got to tell Aunt Claire and Aunt Anna what we did. If Mrs. Riley's son is here in Hedston, he could hurt us. He could hurt them." Neil knew she was right. The aunts needed to know everything, but if he told them now, they might stop him from talking to the doctor, and he wasn't ready to give up his biggest lead, especially since Rebecca had practically handed it to him. "Please don't say anything," Neil said, stepping away from the door at the pie shop, heading down the street. "Not yet." "Neil!" Bree said, her voice raising like a warning alarm. "Where do you think you're going?" "Someone has to help Rebecca," said Neil, beginning to run. "But what about us?" Bree called back. Same thing, Neil thought. His sneaker slipped on the sidewalk as he turned at the corner. Catching himself before he fell, he looked ahead into the mists that swirled between the houses, trying to remember the way to Dr. Simon's office. Chapter 40. After a few blocks, Neil came to an intersection that looked familiar. The sign at the corner read Yarrow Street. Several driveways down, the white building sat back from the road, a small sign crookedly pitched in the middle of the lawn. Dr. Julia Simon, Family Medicine. During his frantic run, Neil's mind had been spinning. Had Nicholas Riley followed him? Was Rebecca watching? If he didn't do what she wanted, would she barrage him with the dangerous visions again? Now that he faced the long walk up to the doctor's front door, reality began to solidify around him. He would ask Dr. Simon about Graylock, about Rebecca. He pressed the doorbell and waited. A few moments later, the knob turned and the doctor's mother, Maud, opened the door. She wore the same floor-length white nightgown she'd had on the last time he'd seen her. Her outfit struck Neil as odd, reminding him of what he'd once imagined was Nurse Janet's uniform, of Rebecca Smith's own white hospital gown. Could Maud's clothing be a clue? Everything seemed to mean something now. Neil blinked at the old woman. She scowled. "Mrs. Simon," he blurted out. "Hi, I'm Neil Cady. I was here a couple days ago." "I remember," she said, reaching out both arms to grasp the doorframe, blocking the way. Her son must have told her about the folder he'd confiscated from Eric. She obviously didn't trust him now. "How's your leg?" "Actually," Neil said, thinking quickly, "that's why I'm here. This was his inn. Do you think Dr. Simon could take a look at it?" "Why?" said Maud. The old woman was as tough as he looked. "Pins and needles," Neil answered, standing his ground. "It hurts." "Have you been cleaning the wound?" She crossed her arms. "I believe that Dr. Simon gave you all the instruction you required." As she leaned toward him, Neil realized how tall this woman was. He imagined her reaching out for him, pushing him down, her long fingers closing around his throat. Then another thought sparked his imagination. If this woman's son had once been a doctor at Graylock Hall, was it possible that she'd worked there too? Had she known Nurse Janet or Nicholas Riley? Was Maud as frightening as she appeared to be, or was he simply annoyed that he disturbed her? Neil stepped back, forcing himself to speak. "I've been trying." His voice came out like a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "But I really wanted to talk to Dr. Simon about it." Maud shook her head violently, as if she might send him forcibly away simply by thinking about it. Neil gritted his teeth. Rebecca would be angry if he didn't get inside, and the longer he stood here, the better chance Nicholas had of tracking him down, if he hadn't already done so. Neil steadied himself, ready to attempt a dash past Maud, when a voice called from the darkness inside the house. "Who is it, Mother?" Maud stepped aside, revealing her son standing at the end of the long hallway, in the entrance to the waiting room. "Neil," said Dr. Simon, stepping forward. "What's wrong?" Neil knew that this was the last chance he'd have to turn and walk back to the relative safety of the pie shop, to meet up with what was sure to be a furious Bree. He paused in the damp air just outside the open door. Then, slowly, trying to stop the shaking he felt in his bones, Neil stepped over the threshold and into the blue hall, past the woman who glared down at him with eyes like acid. "Dr. Simon," he said, "please, I need your help." Chapter 41. The white room was even more cramped than Neil remembered. Tall, freestanding exam lights were shoved into the corners. Stainless steel containers filled with Band-Aids, Q-tips, and syringes were crowded on the countertop. A big red bin labeled Biohazard sat on the floor next to a wide wooden desk. Neil perched once more on the paper-covered table as Dr. Simon sat on the stool by his feet, looking closely at Neil's shin. After a few seconds, the doctor glanced up. "You could have kept it covered for another day or two, but it looks like it's healing just fine without a bandage," he said. "It still hurts?" "A little," said Neil, clutching at both sides of the exam table. He worried that the doctor's mother was listening from the other side of the door, but he knew that the longer he kept up the story of his leg bothering him, the harder it would be to spit out the real reason he'd come. "I'd recommend ibuprofen. I'm sure your aunts—" "Do you remember Rebecca Smith?" Dr. Simon stood up, surprised. He tilted his head in confusion, as if he hadn't heard Neil correctly. Neil forced himself to continue. "She was a patient of yours a long time ago." Dr. Simon stared at him, his puzzlement seeping away, replaced by what looked like frustration. "If you know that, then you already know the answer," said Dr. Simon. Neil took a deep breath and crossed his ankles. He tried to imagine what Bree might have said if she'd had the guts to tag along. "Can you tell me anything about her?" he tried. "I'm sorry," said Dr. Simon. "I can't talk about my other patients." Neil thought quickly. "Can you tell me about working at Graylock Hall?" The doctor glanced at the door as if contemplating walking out. "I moved to Headston and be one of the general medicine physicians at Graylock," he said in a rush. I took care of many patients. Some of them got well, some of them did not. Everyone knows it was not a nice place, but we did the best we could under the circumstances. When they shut Graylock down, I decided to open a private practice here in town. Mother and I lived on Yarrow Street ever since. Leaning forward, Neil asked, "Did your mom work with you?" When the doctor stepped closer to the door, Neil tried a different question. "Did you know all the patients who drowned?" Dr. Simon blinked. "What do you know about Rebecca Smith?" he asked. "I know she died at Graylock Hall," Neil heard himself say. "I know she drowned in the lake." "Do you really?" Dr. Simon's mouth seemed to twist into a slight smile. "And how do you know that?" Neil needed to make Dr. Simon understand how serious he was, so he said, "She told me." Dr. Simon's mouth dropped open momentarily before he clicked it purposefully shut again, holding on to that strange, forced smile. "She told you," he said with a look of condescension. "Of course she did. And what else did she tell you?" Here was the big question. Neil closed his eyes. "She said she was murdered." "Ah, yes." Dr. Simon nodded as if this suddenly all made sense. "You've heard the stories." He chuckled. "You do know that Janet Riley lives north of here. She's a lovely woman. We were friends once." "Nurse Shannon wouldn't hurt anyone?" asked Neil. The doctor shook his head. After a few seconds, he said, "So who do you think did it? Who murdered Rebecca Smith?" The ghost stories at Graylock Hall had twisted so many times in the past few days. Neil was having a hard time keeping everything straight. He knew he could probably come up with a list of suspects if he thought hard about it. Nurse Shannon, who everyone believed had been the killer, was now an old woman, but her son Nicholas certainly seemed like a threat. Dr. Simon hadn't answered Neil's question about Maud working at the hospital with him, but did that mean that his mother might be guilty of murder? And then there was Dr. Simon himself. Several days ago, he'd confiscated Eric's folder. He may have been the one who told the aunts about their first trip to Graylock Hall, and now he wore that strange smile. Was he merely accused or amused at Neil's persistence, or did his expression hint at something darker? Neil tensed up. Talking about Rebecca had brought attention to himself. If the murder was still out there, he or she wouldn't be happy that he was asking questions. But what else was he supposed to do? Sit in a closet and hide away? Dr. Simon stepped close to the exam table, his eyes glinting with an icy intensity, and placed his warm hand on Neil's shoulder. "Did Rebecca mention that she was terrified of the dark?" the doctor asked, his voice low, severe. "Or that lightning storm sent her into a total panic? Did she say how she never learned to swim?" Neil listened in silence as the doctor went on. "Did she tell you how very easy it was to slip out of the hospital, to get lost in the reeds, to mistakenly wander into the water?" Neil leaned away, trying to get out the doctor's grip. "What happened to those kids at Graylock Hall was an accident. Horrible, tragic, unforgettable for those of us who were there, but an accident nonetheless. The last thing this town needs is for rumors of murder to surface again. I'm sure Rebecca's family would appreciate a moratorium on the subject." "Rebecca's family?" asked Neil, sliding off the table. "They're in Headston." Dr. Simon flinched, realizing he said too much. "I think it's time for you to go." But Neil's feet felt glued to the floor. If this news wasn't exactly what he had come for, it certainly sounded like a worthy clue. Did Rebecca Smith grow up here? Dr. Simon's face turned red as he moved to the exit. His blush was as close to an answer as Neil had been getting. The doctor grappled with the door, swinging it inward before stumbling, exasperated, into the waiting room. "Mother," he called out, "can you please sort our patient out?" Chapter 42. The hike back to the shop was damp and chilly. Neil stuck to backyards and alleyways. Every time a car passed by, a jolt of nerves rocked his bones. When Neil walked through the shop door, he braced himself. Claire would surely be waiting for him with a worried look. He was certain his sister had told her everything. But the shop was quiet. Bree stood behind the register, glaring at him as he tentatively stepped toward her. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I didn't know what I was looking for," said Neil, "but I definitely found something." Bree chewed at the inside of her lip, curious but unwilling to ask him what he meant. "Did you tell Aunt Claire what's going on? Are we in trouble now?" Bree shook her head, but she still glared at him. Even if she hadn't ratted him out, she wasn't looking happy about it. I thought I would too," said Bree. "After you took off, I came back in here and went to the office, but before I knocked on the door, I felt as though someone was behind me. When I turned, though, no one was there." "Rebecca?" Neil asked. Bree ignored his question. "I heard that voice again. It was so quiet, I'm not sure if it was in my head. It said no." "No?" "That's all. And I suddenly knew I couldn't tell Aunt Claire. For whatever reason, that little no got me. I came back here, feeling someone walking behind me, nearly stepping on my heels. I've been waiting for you ever since." She exhaled. "So what happened? What did you find?" Neil told Bree everything, including Dr. Simon's accidental hint that Rebecca Smith had lived in Hedston and that her family might still be here too. She didn't look happy when Neil suggested they try to track the family down. "Remember that voice you heard in your head?" Neil asked. "It might only have been your own." Bree sighed, tucking her hair behind her ears. "So look her up then," she said. But Neil's internet search in Claire's office didn't show any Smiths in Hedston. "There has to be another way," said Neil, returning to the front counter a few minutes later. "Well, apparently Rebecca doesn't want us to ask the aunt," said Bree, "so that's out." Neil nodded, even as he considered the precariousness of taking advice from a ghost. "We know other people in Hedston besides the aunts, though. Wesley's family has been here for years. Maybe they can give us some answers." Chapter 43. After a long conversation with Wesley, Neil hung up the shop's phone and explained the new plan to his sister. It was complicated, but she complimented him on his resourcefulness. Later, as Claire dropped the two of them off at the address Wesley had given Neil, she smiled. "I'm glad you're doing this. I think it would be good for you, too. I've always wished I could have joined a band when I was your age." "It's just a tryout," said Bree, opening the passenger door, grasping the handle of her viola case. "You sure you don't need a ride home?" asked Claire, looking more hopeful than he'd ever seen her. Neil opened his door, too, feeling a heavy blanket of guilt. He promised himself he'd tell the aunts everything sometime soon, no matter the consequences. Eric said he'd drive us when we're done. "Try to be back before dark and call us before we get on the road." She might as well have said, "No long joyrides, please." "I don't want Anna to worry." "We will," said Neil, stepping onto the sidewalk, pushing the door shut. Claire honked the horn as she pulled away. Neil cringed, glancing up the hill. The Diaz's house sat at the top of a large green lawn. 2 stories tall and 5 windows wide, it was bigger than most of the other houses in Hedston. Painted gray, the building nearly blended into the fog. Blood-red shutters flanked each window, standing out like wounds. Neil looked around for Eric's car, but the only vehicle nearby was the one parked halfway up the house's long driveway. It was a small, familiar-looking red hatchback. This was the car that had passed them a couple days ago during the walk to the library. According to Eric, Bobby Phelps, the jerk who shouted at them, would be here. The hatchback made everything concrete. There were no ghost stories here, no haunted hospital, no town legends, no nightmares. Neil's goal was real. He was about to face real people, the possibility of real fists, real pain. From behind Neil and Bree, the sound of tires on wet pavement came up the street. They turned to find Mrs. Baptist's car pulled to the curb. A moment later, Eric and Wesley stepped out, wearing worried expressions. "Wesley filled me in," said Eric, pocketing his mother's keys. "Sorry my parents weren't any help." He smiled. "But at least now we've got a chance for some awesome payback." "You sure you believe all this ghost stuff now?" Bree asked. "Whatever." Eric shrugged and flashed a well-practiced grin. Either way, I'm happy to be of service, especially if it gets me back in your good graces. Bree looked at the ground and tightened her grip on the viola's case. You guys ready? Wesley added. Well, I've never stuck into someone's house while they were still in it before, said Neil, but there's a first time for everything, right? They all slowly hiked up the driveway. I'm not sure how much time you two will have, Eric said to Neil and Wesley. Me and Bree might get kicked out immediately, so you'll need to get upstairs as quickly as possible. Melissa's old room is the first door on the left, facing the back of the house. Neil interrupted. Her mother's high school yearbooks are on a bookshelf there? Mixed in with Melissa's own. Eric nodded. I remember flipping through them one night. Every year is labeled on the spine. Grab the earliest ones. According to the dates you found in her file, I'm pretty sure this Rebecca girl was in Mrs. Diaz's class. The yearbooks will definitely have some sort of dirt on her. As they came closer to the garage, a loud drumbeat echoed across the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Eric nodded at Neil and Wesley, then pointed toward the backyard. He had to raise his voice slightly so that they could hear him. The patio door is always unlocked. Head straight through the kitchen. Stairs are on the left. The boys nodded. Turning to Bree, Eric said, Ready to impress them with your skills? I hope so, Bree said, holding up her case. She looked slightly green. I'm supposed to be your new girlfriend, right? Eric nodded. Melissa's brother, Tony, was mad when he found out that she'd been hanging out with me again. That's the reason they kicked me out. If I'm with you now, I'm hoping they'll let me back in, at least for a few minutes. I thought you said you quit. Wesley said quietly. Eric scowled. Same difference. I'm not really trying to get back in. I'm just trying to help you guys figure out this ghost nonsense. So we'll be acting then? Said Bree. Sir, he said, amused. And they're not expecting us? Eric shook his head. I've known about this rehearsal since last week, when everything went down. How serious are you and I exactly? Bree asked him. Like, are we in love? We're as serious as it takes for these two to get in and get out and get fast and safe. He swatted at Wesley's hair. I still don't understand why I couldn't just ask Melissa for the yearbook myself, said Neil. She likes me. Don't be too sure, said Eric. Yes, Melissa wants to keep your job at Claire Sop, but that doesn't mean she'd help out, especially not the brother of the new girl in town. Bree flinched. She's jealous of me? Eric stared at her for several seconds, then nodded. Pretty much. Bree looked as if she wanted to smile, but knew she shouldn't. One more question, said Neil, trying to squash the awkward feeling that had risen up among all of them. What happens if Wesley and I get caught? Eric glanced at the red hatchback parked behind them, his face growing serious. Bobby Phelps's catcall, Two Freaks and a Geek, seemed to hum silently in the quiet fog as the drumbeat inside the garage grew louder and faster. Let's not think about that, Eric said, taking Bree's free hand and stepping toward the wide open door. Chapter 44. As Bree and Eric disappeared into the garage, Neil and Wesley were able to sneak around to the back of the house. Inside the patio doors, a colorful glass lampshade hung over the kitchen table. It cast a mystical glow into the yard where the two boys stood. Neil yanked the door handle. It slid open. The muffled drumbeat stopped abruptly. Wesley's eyes went wide, and he looked as if he might turn and run. After a few seconds, Neil tugged on Wesley's ratty sweater, dragging him into the quiet kitchen. Muted voices came from behind a closed door on their right, the garage. Neil didn't know what reaction Eric and Bree were getting from the rest of the guys, but that wasn't important. What mattered was the distraction. The staircase was visible through a doorway in the opposite wall. Nodding to Wesley, he crept toward it. A plush gold carpet covered the stairs and dampened their footsteps. Once Neil reached the upstairs hall, he heard a different kind of sound coming from the garage. No drums, no voices. His sister's strings were singing. That was a relief. They had some time to explore. The door on their left was closed. Wesley tentatively pushed it open. Bree's viola continued to echo through the house, coating the evening with a soothing sense of safety. Is this the right room? Wesley whispered, peering further in. After his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Neil glanced in to find a twin-sized bed, dark purple walls covered with posters of rock bands from the 90s, a pile of dirty laundry underneath an open window. Beside a closet door, a tall bookcase was crammed with so many volumes, Neil worried briefly that even if he found the books he was looking for, he'd never be able to squeeze them out. "Looks like it, come on." Keeping the light off, Neil headed toward the shelves. Wesley followed close behind, closing the bedroom door. Eric happened right. The yearbooks were grouped together on the bottom shelf. There were 8 in total. The green, faux leather spines were pristine, and on them the gold-stamped years seemed to sign almost magically. Neil wiggled the first 4 books out from the shelf in one clump. "This must have belonged to Mrs. Diaz," he said, handing 2 of them to Wesley. They were about to crack the books open when they heard a noise in the hallway, footsteps slowly shuffling against the carpet. Someone was upstairs with them. The boy stood, unsure what to do. Even if the rear window had been a viable escape option, there wasn't time to reach it. Wesley nudged Neil's arm and nodded at the closet. Chapter 45. They moved swiftly, shutting the door almost completely before they heard a click followed by hinges creaking from across the room. As clothes hangers poked his spine, Neil held his breath and hugged the yearbooks against his chest. The space was small and smelled weird, like a mix of flowers and sweat. He felt Wesley's shoulders against his own. Neither of them said a word. A crack of gray light came in through the slight gap at the closet door. Footsteps padded deliberately toward them. Neil braced himself as the presence came closer. A dark shape stepped in front of the closet, nearly blocking out the last little bit of light. Neil pressed himself backward into the closet. He heard a gurgling noise beside him, Wesley's stomach. It was no comfort to find his friend panicking too. The figure continued to stand before the closet, as if trying to make up its mind whether or not to grab the knob and pull. Neil's head spun as he strained to hear his sister's music, but it wasn't playing any longer. What if Eric and Bree had been forced to give away their plan to the band? What if the guys were furious? What if Bobby Phelps, 2 freaks, had come upstairs and was standing just on the other side of this door? Neil's imagination took another leap forward and placed Nicholas Riley's face onto the shadowy form outside. An odd smell wafted inside the closet, different from the one he'd experienced moments ago. This was a moldy, rotten aroma. Plant decay. Neil's knees buckled. He knew who was standing out in the bedroom. He felt for Wesley's hand just to be sure he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure appeared to be staring at them through the gap. Neil couldn't make out any features. It was too dark. The scent grew stronger and he felt nauseous. The shadows seemed to squeeze at him. His own fear choked the air from his lungs, and that familiar, painful feeling crept from his fingertips up his arms. "Rebecca," he thought, "why are you doing this? We're trying to help you." The bedroom light flicked on. A sliver of light burst through the opening at the closet door. The shape that had been standing just outside was gone. Now a humming voice entered the room. It was Melissa Diaz. Again, Neil's stomach dropped. Through the gap, Neil watched Melissa plop down on the bed and kick off her shoes. He figured she wouldn't be so peppy if she knew that Eric and Bree had arrived together. She clearly wasn't in on band practice. She reached over and turned on her clock radio. Pop music burbled out from the tiny speaker. She sang along, stretched and yawned, looking as if she was settling in for a while. Neil's mind raced, trying to think of some way he and Wesley might be able to get out, or at least signal to Bree that they were stuck. Then another thought came along and stomped on his foot. What if Bree and Eric had assumed that he and Wesley had made it out without a problem? What if they'd simply left? The closet door creaked open several inches, and Melissa stopped singing. Neil clenched his jaw, ready to smack Wesley for even thinking about touching the door. But when he turned to look at his friend, Wesley shook his head slightly. He hadn't been near it. If neither of them had moved, and Melissa was still on the bed, then Neil knew only one other person could have tugged on the knob. Please, Rebecca, he thought, don't. Tony? Melissa said, her voice trembling. Is that you? She sat up as the closet door opened another couple of inches. Neil had to squeeze closer to Wesley so that she wouldn't see him. This isn't funny! Across the room, the door to the hallway slammed open and Melissa screamed. Neil and Wesley couldn't see what she was seeing. Who's there? She shouted. Wesley whispered in Neil's ear, What the heck is going on? It has to be Rebecca. Seconds later, Neil watched as the entire contents of the bookcase tumbled onto the floor in front of the closet with a crash, followed immediately by the case itself. Melissa screamed again. She dashed out of the bedroom and raced quickly down the stairs. Neil understood what Rebecca had done. She'd known Melissa was coming and had warned them into hiding. Knocking over the bookcase had gotten Melissa out. Rebecca hadn't meant to scare them. She was helping them escape. Now, he said, let's go. Chapter 46. The boy shoved the closet door against the shelves, pushing forward with all their weight. They squeezed themselves out through the small gap into Melissa's bedroom. Clutching the yearbooks, Neil and Wesley careened into the hallway and down the stairs. They froze in the foyer, listening to a commotion of voices coming into the kitchen from the garage. Melissa must have alerted her brother and his friends that someone had been upstairs. The bookcase crash had probably shaken the whole house, freaking out everyone even more. In the foyer, Neil and Wesley spun toward the front door. They yanked it open and darted out into the night, running and sliding across the damp lawn, not slowing until they reached the street. They crouched behind Mrs. Baptist's car, unsure what to do. Shouting continued to come from up the hill, louder now than before. Tony and his friends must have discovered the ruins of the bookcase in Melissa's room. Two shadowy figures exited the garage and dashed down the driveway. One of them was hugging a large case, the viola. Eric drove, not knowing where they were going. Neil and Wesley peered out the rear window, making sure no one was following them. After several hurried turns, Eric pulled the car to the curb and flicked on the overhead light. Water condensed on the windows, collecting and streaking down the glass. They were parked on a purgatory street, surrounded by forests, the nearest houses far ahead and behind them. The trees on either side of the road were becoming silhouettes against an already muted sky, the sun still hidden behind thick clouds. If they didn't head home soon, the ants might come back to the Diaz house looking for them. Right now, though, Neil knew they had bigger problems. Well, the band fell in love with Bree, especially when she started playing, said Eric. Bree shook her head as if she might be able to wiggle away from her embarrassment. But what happened with you guys? Melissa burst into the garage, screaming her pants off. From the back seat, Neil and Wesley recounted their story. Eric and Bree listened with urgent attention. Yearbooks, said Eric after they had finished, pointedly ignoring the tale's ghostly aspect. Brilliant. What gave you guys the idea to track them down, Neil? Dunno, said Neil. The idea popped into my head this afternoon when I was on the phone with Wesley. It just came to me. I almost could have sworn a voice had whispered into my ear, but it definitely wasn't Wesley's voice. Bree shivered and hugged herself. Anyway, we're just lucky you knew where to find the books we needed, Eric. I can't believe we pulled that off, said Wesley. When it was happening, I wasn't sure we would. So, if Rebecca wanted you guys to get these yearbooks out of there, Eric said after they'd finished, stealing an uncertain glance at Bree, there must be something good inside. That's what we were hoping, said Neil. The book sat on the seat between him and Wesley. All four of them stared at the pile. There's one for each of us. He picked them up and handed them out. Neil held Rebecca's freshman year in his lap. He opened the class photo section and quickly found her portrait surrounded by those of her classmates. She stared up at him from the page, her eyes as wide as her toothy smile. Her long brown hair was parted down the middle and tucked behind protuberant ears. She glowed with the happiness that made Neil sad. According to the earliest pictures, Rebecca could have been any girl on the verge of great things, a girl filled with possibility, who saw the world as a treasure chest waiting for her to come and crack it open. Put together, however, the 4 volumes revealed a different kind of story, one whose morbid ending became more apparent with every page turned. By her senior year, the exuberance that had existed in Rebecca's 14-year-old face was gone, as was her smile and any hope that it might have contained. Neil, Wesley, Bree, and Eric spent nearly half an hour staring the books with one another, flipping through the pages and indexes, looking for a moment, some indication of where, when, and why things had changed for her. "Wait a second," said Bree, after she'd gotten hold of Rebecca's junior year. "Here's something strange." She lifted the book so they all could see. Near the front, a photo of a woman filled nearly half a page. A name was printed beneath the photograph, Mrs. Alice Curtin. Mrs. Curtin had brown hair cut into a bob. She wore large glasses, a reserved smile, and a pink twin-piece sweater set. She looked off as if she'd been caught unprepared for the shutter to close. At the top of the page were the words, "In Memoriam." The principal had written a brief eulogy about Alice, about how much the town would miss her, about the good work she had done at the school. He proclaimed that the accident that had caused her passing was a tragedy and should act as a reminder that every day must be seen as a gift. "She died earlier that year," said Bree. "Who was she?" asked Wesley. "Duh," said Eric. "She was obviously a teacher." "Yes," said Bree, "but she was more than that." She pointed at what looked like a short poem at the very bottom of the page. "For my mother. Do you remember the way home?" she always asks, like a woman in a fairy tale protecting her daughter from the dangers of the world. "Yes," I remind her dutifully as I step into the woods, haunted by a desire for certainty and her dread. I promise to leave a trail of clues. In the dark, for her or me or someone who follows, the breadcrumbs glow. None of us are alone. Rebecca Smith. "Alice Curtin wasn't just any teacher," Bree continued, her face drawn, her skin pale beneath the car's overhead light. "She was also Rebecca's mom." Chapter 47. By the time Eric had driven Neil and Bree back to the aunt's house, the wind had picked up and lightning flashed in the distance. The sun had gone down, and the front porch light was on, straining to cast its orange glow through the thick mist and increasingly strong rain. Turning into the driveway, Eric sighed. "Will Claire and Anna be mad that you're late?" "We'll be fine," said Neil, his voice hushed by doubt. He gathered the yearbooks from the back seat and opened the car door. "But we have to find out some more about Mrs. Curtin. Learning what happened to her will give us a clue about what happened to her daughter. These must be the glowing breadcrumbs Rebecca left behind." He thought of her poem. "A trail of clues in the dark," he said, wearing a bleak smile. "Let's talk tomorrow, okay?" Everyone nodded, their exhaustion weighing heavily on them. As Bree got out of the car, grappling with her case, Wesley slipped past her into the front seat. Before she closed the door, Eric leaned across him, calling out the window. "Hey, Bree," he said, "you really do play mean violin. Those guys would be lucky to have you in their band." Bree smiled crookedly. "Thanks," she said. "Same to you." Neil noticed with amusement that she hadn't corrected him. She played viola, not violin. A growl of thunder rolled by overhead as Eric drove off. Neil and Bree dashed across the lawn toward the front porch and up the steps. Before she could reach for the door, Neil grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said, nearly dropping the 4 books as he glanced back at the driveway. "Look." 2 vehicles were parked there instead of the usual one. The aunt's Chevy sat closest to the barn. Behind it, a black minivan seemed to slumber. "Isn't that Mom's car?" The front door swung inward. From behind the screen door, a tall figure stood in silhouette, staring out at Neil and Bree. "Well, look who finally made it back!" said a deep voice. Neil's body went instantly numb. He hadn't heard the voice in such a long time. His instincts told him he must be dreaming. He shivered. The cold water that soaked his shirt seeped into his skin. He realized, unfortunately, that he was awake. Bree stepped forward, a strange smile plastered across her face. "Dad?" Her voice was unnaturally high and shook like a child who was on the verge of tears. "What are you doing here?" Chapter 48. Inside, Neil and Bree sat on the couch in the living room as their father leaned against the fireplace mantel and told them his story. Claire and Anna listened from the kitchen. This was the second time they had heard him go through it that evening. From the looks on their faces, Neil knew they couldn't stomach it again. California hadn't worked out, he explained. The casting agent had broken every promise she'd made. He said that he'd come back to New Jersey mostly because he missed his family, and he knew they'd welcome him home. "This afternoon," said their father, "I flew into Newark. I told a cab back to the house and borrowed your mom's car. I drove all the way up there for you guys." He grinned as if he'd just presented them with an enormous, brightly wrapped gift. "You can pack your things. We'll leave tonight. What'd you say?" Neil wished he could squeeze himself backward into the couch hard enough that it would swallow him up. He couldn't look at his father's face. Determination and hope combining into an expression that filled Neil with nausea. "What does Mom think?" Bree asked. The little girl with the wavering voice was gone. A chip of the gleam fell from Rick's smile. "We'll surprise her!" Neil found himself shaking his head. "No," he said, "I'm not leaving." Now Rick's smile crumbled entirely. "We'll be together again," he said, stepping toward his children. "Come on, don't be like that. Bree, can't you talk some sense into your brother?" Bree seemed to choke on her thoughts. Then she said, "If you knew Neil at all, you'd understand that sometimes he doesn't make sense. I certainly don't have the power to change his mind, and I doubt you do either." She turned and smiled weakly at Neil, and he knew that she hadn't meant to insult him. What Bree had said was true, and she seemed proud of him for it. "Maybe if you'd been around for the past few months, you'd have seen that." Rick turned red. "Well, you guys might not have a choice." He crossed his arms. "After everything your aunts have told me, I'm not sure how much longer they'd like to keep you around." Anna came from the kitchen and stood in the doorway. "I can tell you the answer to that one," she said. "Bree and Neil are welcome to stay as long as they want to." Neil's face burned with surprise. Was that true? Had his fears about being sent away only been in his head? Maybe, maybe not. Either way, his father's appearance had galvanized the aunts against him. Rick scoffed. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I think we'll pass." "It's more complicated than that," said Claire, joining Anna in the door. "Linda may still need some time to herself. Did it even occur to you to ask her what she wants? Just because you've decided to come home doesn't mean we're all ready to have you back." Anna sighed. She took Claire by the arm and led her around the corner into the hallway. Rick was left alone in the living room with Neil and Bree. "Thanks a lot," he whispered, his tan face looking sunburned and suddenly old. "I'm sorry, Dad," said Bree, reaching out for his hand, but he stepped away. Then, to Neil's horror, she added, "We'll think about it, okay?" A moment later, Claire and Anna came back into the room. Anna nodded toward the front door. "Come on, Rick," she said. "Let's go for a ride." "A ride where?" "We need to talk in private," said Claire, glancing briefly at Neil and Bree. "You can take Anna and me to dinner." "What about us?" Neil asked, standing up. "There's some food on the stove for you two," said Anna. Neil hadn't been asking about dinner, but he kept his mouth shut. "Help yourselves, we won't be long." Annoyed, Rick shook his head as he grabbed his car keys from his jacket pocket. He glanced at his children. "Go pack your things," he said again. He turned and followed the ants out to the front door. Chapter 49. The minivan started up with a roar. The headlights shined momentarily through the living room windows before the car backed out of the driveway, its tires spinning on the slick road as their father gunned the engine. Seconds later, Neil and Bree were alone. They stood in the foyer, staring at the door as if it might burst open again, all three adults laughing and patting each other's shoulders, proclaiming how funny a joke the last 15 minutes had been. But that didn't happen. The rain only came down harder, raising a din of white noise that threatened to drown out the sound of Neil's own thoughts. Glancing at his sister, he forced himself not to speak, because he knew if he did, the words would be, "This is what you wanted, right?" "What do we do?" she asked, almost as if to herself. "Should we pack?" Neil shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere with him, at least not until Aunt Claire and Aunt Anna kick us out." In the living room, he slid over the top of the couch and landed with a whoomp on the cushions. The stack of yearbooks that had been sitting there toppled to the floor. Rebecca's junior year landed open to the page remembering her mother. Bree stood behind him, looking at the book from over his shoulder. "I suppose we need to decide which are more important right now, the problems of the living or the problems of the dead." She came around and sat down. Picking up the remote control, she turned on the television. "I honestly don't want to think about either." An old black and white movie was on. Neither of them recognized the actors, but Bree didn't change the channel. She seemed to stare right through the screen, as if she was seeing something Neil could not. Neil picked up the yearbook from the floor and examined Alice Curtin's portrait again. He read over Rebecca's poem several times, the strange words seeming to slowly seep into his skull. Why did Alice have a different last name, he wondered. She must have married a man who was not Rebecca's father. The incomplete Graylock file had left so many questions unanswered. How frustrating that she wasn't able to just appear and tell him, forced instead to use subtle hints and partial clues. Glowing breadcrumbs. Ever since he and his sister had entered room 13, it seemed that these clues had led them down a dark, secret stairwell, one that no one had traversed in a very long time. Why them? Was it because they lived so close to Graylock Hall? Or maybe one needed a certain kind of awareness to recognize mysteries hidden in plain sight. Despite the horror of the past year, what had happened between Neil's mother and father may have allowed him and his sister to understand the world in a way others did not. Like how Wesley noticed green men in ordinary hillsides, Neil and Bree had been forced to see the world in a different way. Maybe this was the reason Rebecca was drawn to them. Maybe this was why she'd taken them to the lake and shown them her death. Glowing breadcrumbs. But no, Neil thought. She hadn't given them nightmares to merely make them aware that she died, or even to learn that she'd been murdered. She wanted them to do something for her. She needed them to see the clues she left behind. She knew that, because of their mom, they'd be more likely than most to help. Looking into the yearbook, Neil's heart felt as if it had stopped. The poem. It had suddenly changed shape. The biggest clue yet stared directly up at him. His hands trembled as he lifted the book to show his sister. "Look," he said, "she left you a message." When Bree noticed how pale Neil had become, she grabbed the book from his hands, then reached out and smoothed his hair away from his forehead. "What's wrong?" "The first letter in every line of Rebecca's poem," Neil managed to say. "Read them straight down." Bree concentrated on the page. She recited the poem out loud. "Do you remember the way home?" She always asks, like a woman in a fairy tale protecting her daughter from the dangers of the world. "Yes," I remind her, dutifully, as I step into the woods, haunted by desire for certainty and her dread. I promise to leave a trail of clues, in the dark, for her or me or someone who follows. The breadcrumbs glow. None of us are alone." A look of horror blossomed across her face, and her mouth fell open in shock. "Daddy did it," she whispered. Chapter 50. There was a flash of light, a crash of thunder, and the room went suddenly dark. They both screamed, then moved so quickly toward each other on the couch that they nearly bumped heads. It took them several seconds to realize what had happened. The storm had knocked the power out. Neil glanced around the room, but he couldn't see much. The rain continued to pound the roof. Lightning flashed again, briefly revealing tree branches outside, whipping about in a strong wind. Several seconds later, the house shook under the crushing sound of thunder. Neil pulled his knees up to his chest and hugged himself. Thunderstorms didn't usually bother him, but on top of everything else, this one was a nightmare. He felt the yearbook poking into his leg. He squatted it away, and it fell to the floor with a loud slap. Rebecca Smith died on a night like this. I wish we had cell phones, said Bree, as if deliberately trying to not think about the ghost story they were living. Neil took his sister's hand. Bree, he said, we know who killed her. She wrote it in the yearbook. Bree was quiet for a few seconds, then nodded. She wanted everyone to know, but was too scared to tell. That's why she looked so different from her sophomore to junior year, said Neil, like two different girls. Shadow people. What causes that? Fear? If she knew her mother had been murdered by her father, maybe she was afraid that she'd be next. Yeah, she might have been right, especially if her father thought she might tell someone. She did tell, said Neil, but did she find out? Maybe, said Bree. Maybe not. We know she went into Graylock afterward. Her doctor said she was crazy, but was she really? You think she was pretending? Neil asked. Maybe she thought she'd be safe in there. But she wasn't safer. He tracked her down. He knew where she was. He was her father. And since they lived here in Hedston, he must have also known that several patients had drowned in that lake, said Neil. Drowned on nights like this, when the power went out and that back door unlocked automatically. Rebecca hadn't considered that. On the nights he died, her father knew that if he got her out of the building, he could make her death look like an accident, another tragic drowning, and she never attempted to tell what he'd done to her mother again like she had in the yearbook. So horrible, Bree whispered. Neil and Bree stared at each other for several seconds, their eyes growing accustomed to the darkness. The wind howled through the eaves above. The wood creaked, sounding as though someone were walking around in the attic. Bree glanced at the ceiling. I really wish we could call someone. We'll be fine until the ants come home, said Neil, trying to reassure himself. And then what? Bree asked, finding her voice again. We pack our things and leave with Dad? We can't. We need to find Rebecca's father. But he's a killer, Neil, Bree whispered. The television flickered blue light. Static came across the screen. Hey, look, she said, relieved. The electricity's back. But the rest of the house remained dark. Only the television seemed to be working. I don't think so, said Neil nervously. Together, they watched as a fuzzy image came into focus through the grainy TV show. Soon, the picture was sharp, clear, and vividly bright. A pair of antlers hanging from a wood-paneled wall. Oh no, said Bree. The image shifted, showing a piano bench piled high with sheet music. Neil knew that the next would be the fireplace with the white birch logs piled on the andirons. But no, the final image was different this time. When the white logs appeared, Neil noticed that they were spattered with drops of a dark red liquid. Blood. Chapter 51. Neil stood, his entire body tingling with goose flesh. Did you see that? He pointed at the television, but the image had changed. The antlers again. Which part? Said Bree, standing too, taking his hand. The piano bench flickered by again, and finally, the third image answered her question. She gasped when she noticed the spatter, then glanced at Neil. What does it mean? Neil didn't answer. He didn't know. The three pictures flashed by repeatedly, faster and faster, until they became a blur not much different than the static out of which they'd appeared. The screen turned bright red and then black. Again, they were tossed into darkness, unprepared. The front door slammed open. The wind rushed into the foyer. Bree screamed. Neil dashed around the couch, catching the handle and pushing with all his might until the latch had clicked shut. He flipped the deadbolt. "How did that happen?" asked Bree, a high voice in the shadows of the living room. Neil knew her real question. Had someone opened the door? In the dining room, the floor creaked. They turned toward the noise. "Who's there?" Neil asked, but of course no one answered. "Neil," said Bree, making her way to the foyer. "I really don't like this." "Well, I'm having a blast," Neil said. Bree's lip trembled and he immediately hugged her, feeling bad for the joke. "Do you want me to wait for everyone outside on the porch?" In response, the brightest lightning bolt yet struck just across the street, followed by an explosion that seemed loud enough to break eardrums. The two leaped away from the door, tripped, and tumbled to the floor near the bottom of the stairs. Blinded, Neil blinked the flash out of his eyes and tapped at his temples until he was certain he still had all of his senses. Another creak came from down the hallway. This one sounded closer. Silently, Bree waved at Neil, then pointed at the stairs. Was he really suggesting they go hide up there? He raised his eyebrows in an expression that asked, "Are you nuts?" "We'd be trapped," he whispered. Then a deep voice called softly from the other room. "Rebecca!" The voice sounded far away and close at the same time. "Come here, sweetheart!" Bree clutched to Neil's hand, crushing his fingers against the floor. They froze as another footstep fell closer still. Was Rebecca's father a ghost too? The idea seemed suddenly plausible. Their internet search hadn't turned up any local Smiths, and there would be no Smiths left in Hedston if they were all deceased. How badly had this man wished to keep a secret? Ghosts can't hurt you, Neil thought. Baloney. Rebecca had hurt them many times, but was it possible for the dead to silence the living completely? Neil's mind ran laps around the room. His eyes fell upon the cordless phone that sat on the sideboard against the wall, but the connection light was out. With no power, that phone would be as useless as a cell. They needed a phone that plugged directly into the wall, a landline. He thought he remembered seeing one out in Anna's studio, in the barn. "Rebecca!" The voice called once more. "You're safe now! Come out, darling!" Another footstep creaked on a floorboard around the corner of the staircase. "Rebecca!" Any closer and he'd be upon them. Chapter 52. Neil seized his sister's hand so hard that she cried out. He stood, dragging her to her feet. "What are you?" Bree started to ask, but Neil dashed toward the front door, pulling her behind him. Outside, the rain was coming down so ferociously it hurt as it hit them. As Neil flew around the corner of the house toward the driveway, he realized that it wasn't merely water falling from the sky, but hail as well. Chunks of ice as big as cherries bounced off the asphalt path that led to the studio. The dark shadow of the barn rose up before them. Neil nearly slipped and fell, but caught himself just in time. He prayed that the door was unlocked. Bree cried out from behind him as she too struggled to stay on her feet. Neil turned to see if she was okay. At that moment, another flash lit the night. Back by the house, a dark silhouette stood, tall, rigid. A solid mass of shadow. Mixed with the thunder, his voice rose up in the night. "Rebecca!" Neil swallowed the panic rising from his stomach. They had to reach the phone in the barn. The building was still a dozen yards ahead. He pushed himself to run faster than he ever had before. He stumbled over the icy obstacles covering the driveway. One large lump fell from the high roof of the barn and struck his cheek just below his eye. "Ow!" he cried. The world went white. Lightning or pain, but there was no time to stop. As Neil reached for the doorknob, a flash of foliage appeared around him. He was suddenly enveloped by the tall, thin reeds of Graylock Lake. He remembered what Rebecca had felt in the dream, the terror of being chased, the knowledge that one slip could cost her life. And did. For just a moment he was there. He was her, and the shadow behind him was reaching for his neck, ready to grab, to shove, to push down and hold him underneath the surface of the freezing water. Cold, wet metal filled his palm. Neil clutched the knob and turned. He shoved the door open as Bree crashed into him from behind, knocking the two of them to the floor once more. Turning over, Neil kicked at the door. It slammed shut. They were alone in the barn. Anna's desk was on the far side of the room. Once there, Neil tried to flick on the desk lamp, but the barn had no power either. Focus, he told himself. Then he saw the phone sitting in his cradle on the other end of the desk. When Neil held the receiver to his ear, he cried out in joy. The dial tone buzzed musically, calmly, as if trying to assure him that everything was going to be okay. Bree came up beside him, stammering. I saw the swamp. Just now. I was there. Her father was coming for me. I saw it too, said Neil, turning the receiver over, looking for the glow of the push button keypad. He brought us there, just like Rebecca did in our dreams. But how? Why? I don't know, said Neil. Exasperated, he spun toward his sister. Who am I calling? The ants? She said, her voice wobbly with panic. Dad? No cell phone service, you know that. Call the police. And tell them what? That a murderous ghost is chasing us? That we learned he killed his daughter and now is coming for us too? I don't know. Call Wesley. Call Eric. Anyone. By the time they get here, something loud crashed out on the driveway. Neil craned his head to see through the window of the barn door, but the night gave no clue who or what was out there. He imagined a face staring back at them, cloaked in pitch, his smile growing wide, the rain mixing with blood and saliva as it ran down his shattering chin. Neil groaned, a cramp stabbing his side. His cheek felt warm where the piece of hail had hit him. Bree shook her head and closed her eyes. Her own face was wet, rain, tears. Neil couldn't be sure, but he knew just how she felt, helpless. Wait a second, he said. He stuffed his hand into his pocket, praying silently that he was wearing the shorts he'd had on the other day. His fingers closed upon a small scrap of paper. Yes, he pulled out the scrap, unfolded it, and glanced at the smear name scribbled there. Andy. Neil handed the paper to Bree. Quick, he said, read me the phone number. Chapter 53. They remained huddled underneath Anna's desk until a flash of light streaked across the studio's wall. Not lightning this time. An engine rumbled all the way up the driveway. Andy's headlights shined blindingly through the window in the barn door. Neil and Bree sprinted outside. The rain had begun to let up. Standing next to his truck, Andy opened his arms and both of them barreled into him. He hugged them tightly as they shivered with both cold and fear. Moments later, he held them at arm's length. Is he still in the house? He asked, glancing up. On the phone, they told Andy that they thought someone had broken into the aunt's house. It had been easier than trying to explain everything else. We don't know where he went, said Bree. Can we please just get out of here? Neil asked, worried that Rebecca's father was watching from the shadows. Maybe he has to take a peek inside the house, said Andy, stepping away from the truck. We don't want the ants coming home to find some creep waiting for them. Neil held his sister's hand. But what if he's waiting for you? Andy stared at the house, searching for a sign of an intruder. After a few seconds, he sighed and turned back to the truck. Tell you what, we'll head back to my house and try to reach the ants from there. Sound like a plan? They all squeezed into the front seat. As Neil swung the truck's door shut, he sighed, relieved to be in safety's arms again. Andy reversed toward the road. The barn began to shrink before it disappeared into the rain-swept shadows. The house stood in the darkness beside it, looking forlorn and frightened to be left alone. Andy turned on the radio. Soothing piano music came from the speakers. You kids gave me a good scare. This'll be a good start for our next movie night. Neil secretly hoped they'd all make it that far. As they drove off toward Andy's house, Neil couldn't help but remember that they were heading closer to Graylock. For a moment, he wondered if that was the best idea. but then he glanced in the rearview mirror. Lightning lit the night, and Neil nearly screamed. Brightly illuminated in the road behind them, the man he'd earlier seen standing in the driveway was running toward them. Even over the roar of the truck engine, Neil heard his voice calling, "Rebecca!"